Fit King gofry. Przepyszne, gotowe do zjedzenia gofry bez dodatku cukru. W wersji klasycznej lub oblanej czekoladą. Dostępne tylko w sklepie SFD.
Partnerem kanału jest XTB. Aplikacja inwestycyjna, z którą zaangażujesz do pracy Twoje pieniądze.
Z kartą Zen. Zapomnij o elektronice, która psuje się zaraz po zakończeniu gwarancji.
Partnerem Kanału Zero jest producent boskich kiełbas bez osłonki JBB Bałdyga. Jedz bardziej bosko.
Najnowszy magazyn Zero już dostępny. 400 stron najlepszych autorów. Zamów na magazyn.zero.pl. Włącz powiadomienia i nie przegap żadnej nowości. Pobierz już teraz. Zeskanuj kod QR lub znajdź nas w swoim sklepie z aplikacjami.
W kolejnym odcinku Ground Zero witają Państwo Rajmund Andrzejczak
i Sławomir Dębski.
Gościmy na konferencji gromadzącej najwybitniejszych strategów, wybitne strategiczne umysły z Europy, Stanów Zjednoczonych, krajów położonych na Dalekim Wschodzie, którzy spotykają się w Warszawie, aby rozmawiać o wspólnych strategicznych wyzwaniach.
Myślę, że troszkę się tutaj, Sławek, czujesz jak w domu, bo to ciągle kawał twojego serca zostało w piśmie.
Tak jest. To ciągle organizuje Polski Instytut Spraw Międzynarodowych. Bardzo serdecznie dziękujemy za gościnę. And today we have an enormous pleasure and honor to host in our show Stephen Biegun, one of the best American experts on foreign policy, security policy, on Russia. He actually spent 2 years in Russia running International Republican Institute, 1992-1994, if I'm not mistaken. He worked in a number of American administrations, National Security Council. He was a Deputy Secretary of State under Trump administration. He was also a special U.S. representative to North Korean dialogue, conversations with North Korean partners. We have a great opportunity to talk with you on United States global outlook, how United States assess its own role in world affairs, what are challenges, how transatlantic relations may look like. Steve, great to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here with both of you. Look forward to the conversation.
Perfect timing and perfect place. I think we're sitting in Warsaw, any conference. We have a very dynamic global situation concerning Russia, and we have a super expert, big chance for us to ask some of the difficult questions.
Well, we are actually sitting in a historical place. It's exactly the square behind us when John Paul II in 1979 delivered his famous speech, known from this famous word, "Don't be afraid." So should we be afraid of the world today? Now you have an American Pope, so there is a kind of the link. How do you think about it?
Well, first of all, I do think about it. Last night, I am fortunate enough to be in this hotel, and I have a window that overlooks the square. And I pulled the curtains open last night, and I watched on the rainy square as people would cross it with the cross there where Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, gave his "Be Not Afraid" speech, and I took a picture of it from my hotel room window just to keep for someone whose career spans the period mine does. This was a monumental moment in a monumental era. My time working with Russia, on Russia, actually dates back far before 1992. I was a student in Leningrad in the 1980s, so I also got an up-close look at what the Soviet Union was. And, quite honestly, in 1985, we may have been a little too afraid, because if you had visited the Soviet Union, of course they had a formidable nuclear capability, but it was a country that was rotting from the inside out. And we were still in a Cold War posture, rightfully so, because we couldn't be certain about the safety of Western democracies without that level of preparation. But I think we were probably in hindsight too afraid of what was there. I think the exact inverse is in place now. I think we're not afraid enough of it. And obviously, I don't know if I would call it a satisfaction, but maybe a schadenfreude in the Baltic states, in here in places like Poland, of people who warned about the potential threats from the East for a long time. But those concerns, those warnings weren't taken seriously, especially by Western Europe and as well as the United States. Now, part of our complacency was driven by a hopeful optimism that we would construct a relationship with Russia that would be history changing. And there was a possibility. The period in which I lived in Russia in the early 1990s, there was a sense of real possibility. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. But through the decrepitude of Boris Yeltsin's later years and the transfer of power to a trained intelligence agent in Vladimir Putin, the course was set over the last 25 years to arrive at a point where I do think we need to be a little bit more afraid.
So Steve, before we go deeper, your impression is the Russia stronger or weaker comparing to those days? Is more predictable, less predictable, more aggressive, less aggressive? Is there any measurement in your mind?
I think by the late years of the end of the Cold War, by the late years of the Cold War, there was a fatigue in the Russian population that made it weak. You know, the war in Afghanistan had been deeply unpopular and had even manifested the first signs of independent civil society in Russia, the reaction. But compared to today, where President Putin and his well-organized state effort to mobilize the population, I'm
pretty
afraid,
effective. Yeah.
I'm afraid it's been effective, and I wish it were so, but I don't suffer the illusion that there's somehow lurking inside the Russian population a deep well of dissent that will at some point rise up and say, stop this madness. I just don't think it's there. And I think it's in part because of the effectiveness of the state in indoctrinating an entire generation.
I would like to use this opportunity that we have you in our show to ask you about this, moment when we still believed Russia could actually succeed in its democratic path. 1993. I mean, Yeltsin is coming to Warsaw. He was meeting with Lech Wałęsa, and was a famous communique after this meeting that actually Russia has nothing against Poland joining NATO. A few weeks later, the last Soviet Russian soldier was withdrawn from Poland. That was a historic moment for us, for Poles, because actually we experienced Russian soldier deployments to Poland since 1717. With the little, break of 20s and 30s when we had our independence, Russians and Soviet troops permanently stationed in Poland. So that was a historical moment. How it looked like from your perspective? I mean, a representative of American Republican institution, so with this huge Reagan, first Bush, policy outlook. How it looked from your perspective, sitting in Moscow?
So, I was there both as somebody with quite a bit of experience in Russia, as well as quite a bit of experience in democratic politics. So, I had the experience that was really desired in Russia for people who were trying to build that democracy that we had hoped for. And the appetite was enormous. We weren't missionaries. We weren't there indoctrinating Russians. I ended each week absolutely exhausted by the constant demands on my time and the time of my teams. People would come by our apartment at all hours on the weekends. We had a small office in Moscow, in the center of Moscow. Oftentimes, when I would be traveling around the regions of Russia, and I would always invite people to come meet with us when they were in Moscow. In many cases, these are people who were never even permitted to visit their own capital during their entire life. And their first trip to their capital, their first stop was to our house. So we always kept tea and jam and bread in the house because we invariably would get visitors right from the train station to our house. The appetite was enormous. There was a lot of damage to the Russian people. We had many, many great and inspirational partners, but there was also a post-trauma from the Soviet system. You know, some of these people, particularly the ones who had been repressed, had to really struggle to accept the times they were in, but they tried. And in 1993, it was an amazing year. You could go anywhere, you could do anything. Closed cities were no longer closed. I rode tens of thousands of kilometers on the Russian trains, bringing experts, teams of Russians and Americans, working with local political parties. It was just an endless opportunity, and it was all demand-driven. We weren't forcing this upon the Russians; it was demand-driven. But you know, this was a tumultuous year, 1993. In October, in the first week of October of 1993, the Supreme Soviet, one of the last institutional vestiges of the Soviet Union, rose up in opposition to Boris Yeltsin, and led to the famous clash where you literally had Russian tanks firing on the Russian legislature of sorts. That was happening. I believe that was October 3rd of 1993, and I saved the newspaper that day because there were two things happening on that day. One was that Russian troops were firing on the Russian legislature. The other was Russian soldiers in the South Caucasus shot down a Georgian plane on its way to Sukhumi in negotiations to keep Georgia unified. And so there were different currents flowing at the same time. The war in Chechnya was just beginning to really rage as well. And if you turn your gaze from Moscow to St. Petersburg, there's a former mid-level KGB agent who's just wrapping up his career change as a gypsy cab driver and taking a position controlling the flow of property in the city of St. Petersburg, who, unbeknownst to us, 8 years later would become the leader of Russia.
So it looks like the Russia still requires some understanding, and so learning is issue. And you know, you're here in Warsaw, listen to the people in the conference. The Poles are pretty often blamed that we're Russophobic, and so typically the answer is we are not Russophobic. We know the history, but there's a huge difference between, you know, historical context, our experiences, we exercised the Russian or Soviet occupation and presence here. So you are a little bit unique because you spend a lot of time in Russia, Moscow. How about the understanding of Russia today in the U.S.? Would you say that Trump understands properly what the Russia is about?
And I would, if I may add to this question, because it's an excellent question. You know, when you started your career as a Russian expert, you actually, in some way, were surrounded by the group of excellent specialists on Russia. You know, Zbigniew Brzezinski, George Kennan, Richard Pipes. I mean, there was an army of excellent Russia experts in the United States. How these Russia expertise looks like now?
Yeah. So, you know, I think it's worth dwelling for a moment on this question about Russophobia, because I do think that was in part why the concerns of Central and Eastern Europeans and the Balts, why they were minimized. It was a combination of the optimism and hopeful optimism that Russia could emerge as, you know, what we might call a normal state. But it was also your concerns were discounted because of the perception of Russophobia. But as the old saying goes, that even paranoids have enemies, and Slavic, it wasn't as clear cut in 1991 as you might think. And yes, there was a formidable amount of expertise available, and I learned from or in the writings of people like Pipes and like Kennan and like Solzhenitsyn and many others who were accessible to us. But when 1991 came about, it was an interesting phenomenon. There was a class of Sovietologists who actually either resented or even were alarmed by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And even in the most senior ranks of government, the destabilizing consequences of the collapse of a nuclear-armed empire like the Soviet Union was not taken for granted, as evidenced in the famous Chicken Kiev speech given by President George Herbert Walker Bush. That called for the Ukrainians to subvert.
We need to explain our viewers what was this famous chicken speech.
So in 1991, the Ukrainians, having reawakened a sense of nationhood, were headed towards a national referendum to declare the establishment of a Ukrainian nation and their independence from the Soviet Union or from Russia. And the United States, which was similarly cautioning the Baltic states to move more slowly on their national aspirations, in the person of our then President George Herbert Walker Bush, visited Kyiv and gave a speech where he called upon the Ukrainians to set aside their national aspirations. And it became derisively known to history as the Chicken Kiev speech. The reaction to that, both in Ukraine as well as in the United States, was immediate and harsh. And it turns out to have been just a simple side ramp on a historical direction of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But still, that thinking was very prevalent in the senior-most ranks of government. Yeah. Sovietologists, some of whom were quite comfortable with the Soviet construct and who devoted their entire lives to understanding it and working with it, were likewise at least uncomfortable and in some cases just flat out wrong. I remember a book by a Princeton professor named Stephen Cohen called Sovieticus, and it was a series of columns that he later published into an anthology, and the kind of constant theme is blaming the West for the negative developments in the Cold War and trying to rationalize the Soviet system. And I really enjoyed reading that after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But, we have to be very careful because history comes around multiple times. And so you can be right one day and wrong at least a decade later. Today, starting with expertise, we have hollowed out the expertise. The attention of the United States foreign policy shifted to other parts of the world. First, almost exclusively to the Middle East. We have great expertise in the Middle East in the United States of America, and then subsequently or increasingly to Asia and to China. And both are very important issues and have rightly dominated the attention. But the cost has been deeply diminished capacity and familiarity with Russia. And now we're at a point where the door's closed, and even the opportunities during the Cold War in the 1970s, 1980s, Americans like myself could study in the Soviet Union, could visit the Soviet Union, could make our own independent judgments and develop our own knowledge. You can't do that now. It would be simply dangerous, if not impossible, for an American scholar, much less American student, to visit Moscow today. So we are at a loss in terms of Russian expertise. As far as President Trump goes, I'm sure President Trump is very confident in his knowledge of Russia, and a lot of that confidence rests in his own gut instincts and his belief that he understands people. And so I think to some extent President Trump would think that his people abilities would help him understand Vladimir Putin, for example. I think that's a very dangerous assumption when you're interacting with a trained KGB agent.
Yeah, looking in the effectiveness of negotiation, it's not optimistic that he understands really what Putin is doing again.
Ironically, from reports I hear, the most frustrated party with that is the Russians themselves.
Yeah.
that they yearned for competent, in-depth understanding so they can properly communicate their desires to re-engineer the European security order or to adjust NATO's profile back to 1997 levels. In order to be able to understand that request, you have to know what NATO was in 1997. And the Russians, I think, the reaction is that they don't want an affable, likable businessman who just wants to find some middle ground. They want Ukraine. And they can't get Ukraine if there's not somebody across the table from them who understands the intricacies of what they're doing, which is a great irony. Because if somebody was sitting across the table from them who truly understood the intricacies of what they want, that also would be frustrating for them, because any of us in this generation at that table would tell the Russians to just go straight to hell.
There are a lot of attempts in the United States and around, in other corners of the world to somehow describe the present state of affairs in world affairs in kind of the model way. Some say that we are now in great competition, great power competition. Some say that it's great power rivalry. Some say that we are set into kind of the new Cold War. What's your take on that? Where we are actually in these discussions? How do you read state of affairs?
Yeah. So I agree with the diagnosis of great power competition. I'm not liking our prescription for how to deal with it. So if you want to take this analogy of competition, what do you do when you're preparing for a competition? You train, you prepare, your ability to win is first and foremost based upon you, not your opponent. The only variable you can control to a large extent in a competition is your own fitness for that competition. And I unfortunately don't see a prescription for this moment of great power competition that is emphasizing our fitness. Some of it is performative, some of it is self-gratification, but a truly fit West, prepared for that, democratic West, prepared for that great power competition, we're still far from where we need to be.
Well, I always have some, objections if I hear the phrase Cold War, because immediately it goes to the word black and white, 0-1. There was the Soviet Union and satellite countries, and there was the U.S. with alliances in NATO. That was ideological confrontation and military, but no economical at all. And today, because we would like to go a little bit to the U.S. understanding of new approach to the alliances, and now it's completely different. So the Russia is one of the regions, and then you have a Middle East, and then you have a China, which is completely different because there's a competition, ideologies, but also innovations and technology. So if you could prioritize right now in the new Cold War 2.0, let's say for a second this phrase, which front will be number one, number two, number three? Will it be China with all of the resources, implications, strategy, commitment, or Middle East, Iran with nuclear aspirations, role of Israel, or would be a Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and NATO here? And does it work in that kind of methodology, Cold War, War 2.0 and the priorities?
So, on this issue of new Cold War, there's a neuralgia in the United States for this term, new Cold War. And in fact, it's been used as almost a criticism in our political policy debates. You just want a new Cold War. No, I don't. I don't want a new Cold War. We have this neuralgia, the Cold War. It's very interesting.
Which was won, by the way.
We won. But again, in 1991, another feature, and I'm not sure, I think there were other shortcomings more important than this, but President George Herbert Walker Bush in 1991 forbade his team from talking about the Cold War outcome as a victory. It was an end, but it wasn't a victory. And I think that partially reinforced into the mind of a generation of foreign policy thinkers. But for whatever reason, the terminology New Cold War causes especially the foreign policy establishment to recoil a little bit. It's almost a feeling like we failed. And in a sense, that's probably a fair criticism, that if we're having a new Cold War, something went wrong. Now, we don't have to own all of that failure. The invasion of Ukraine is the responsibility of one person, Vladimir Putin. So it's not like we have to bear all those responsibilities, but we made mistakes. And for sure, there were mistakes made that created conditions that could allow this to happen. As far as the leading front, if you will, this is very much what's being debated in the United States of America right now. There are multiple debates going on in the United States on foreign policy. There's no one view or no one voice, even as consequential as the President of the United States is, in particular at this moment in his presidency. But the jury is out. But here in Europe, you will hear that debate in different ways. In some cases, you will hear that debate as a criticism that the Europeans haven't done enough to provide for the transatlantic defense. Poland is accepted from that criticism always, but we have to be candid. Many of our European allies simply hollowed out their own defense. So that's one element of the criticism. Another element of the criticism you'll hear is that the threat, not criticism, but debate you'll hear is that the threat from China is so enormous that the United States needs to either recenter its capabilities or at least significantly rebalance them so that Europe has more responsibilities for the defense of the transatlantic area and the United States has more responsibility in Asia. But there's yet another part of that debate which seeks the American withdrawal, a retrenchment of the United States, that these commitments to allies are a burden on the country. Those last two groups, the ones who want to pivot away from Europe and exclusively to Asia, and the ones that want to retreat from the world, actually form a temporary alliance. Because people, very thoughtful people, who are trying to figure out what's the right allocation of U.S. influence and capabilities in the world between Europe and Asia, provide cover for the isolationists who simply want to withdraw. And as I say, that those arguments allow isolationists to masquerade as strategists.
Well, I would like to use this your description to ask you about exactly what's behind American thinking about the alliances now. Because, if we use the term the Cold War as a model, so there was a clear strategy behind this term. There was a common ideology. So we want to defend our democratic order. We want to defend rule of law, free market economy. If we read a transatlantic treaty, it's about, the preamble is about that. So there was a coherent ideology behind. There was also a coherent strategy containing the Russians, containing our enemies. The United States needed, allies to do the job. NATO was created. The alliances of United States in Pacific was created, however, different structurally, but there was a clear policy. So now the question appears: if we use this paradigm of the Cold War to describe United States foreign and security policy towards the outside world, do we have a common bipartisan, in fact, policy? Do we have a common bipartisan outlook in United States, what the United States want to do with allies, how they want to use allies, to do what exactly?
At the level of political debate, no. But at the level of national interests, yes. And I think that's a very important distinction, though. In my study of American foreign policy, it has always advanced more often when successful, when it had an appropriate balance between interests, values, and capabilities. The three operate in harmony. And if you embark upon foreign policy or national security initiatives without that balance in place, you're very vulnerable. To proceed based entirely upon interests with no values and no capabilities would be just suicidal. To proceed entirely on values without interests is going to very quickly tire the American people. To proceed with capabilities but no interests and no values, well, that's a madman. And interests and capabilities together could be imperialism. So it has to be some balance between these. At the center of those is the interests. Interests drive American foreign policy across its entire history, 250 years as of next year. And interests don't change as fast as leaders or events. And I have a lot of confidence in interest driving. After American presidential elections every 4 or 8 years are this huge contest of ideas where one side or the other is saying your foreign policy it failed for the following reasons, but almost inevitably or invariably in the aftermath of elections, American foreign policy returns to the mean because it's interests. I kind of see it in the analogy of a dirt road with two ruts down the middle. And you can ride your wagon around and bump over those ruts all you want. Once you get in the ruts, it's kind of the natural place to be. And that's where American interests are. So that's why it's very important that this is where American interests are. The alliance structure that exists in the world today is one of the singular advantages defending American interests worldwide. That's not to say, though, that there's not a political debate over what is the right extent of those. In some ways, there are legitimate questions here for sure. Like, what is the appropriate contribution of allies to that alliance? Can an alliance be effective if it's simply the United States providing security for another country, but no counterpart? In some cases, it can. When it's Iceland, which doesn't have a military, it's its geographic location that it contributes to the alliance.
But now we have the big emotions and in the discussion that interests are a little bit higher than values, and probably is very, very common interest and transactional approach. Would you say these kind of a balance was changed a little bit? Is more interest or less values narratives in the U.S. foreign policy?
At the margins, yes, and case by case may be different. Of course, this was, I think, most clearly laid out in President Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia just a week ago, where he spoke of an end of the era of nation building, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That now we will act on interests. We won't concern ourselves with the internal affairs of other countries. I get it.
Challenging.
I get it. And actually, ironically, the person who he was most aiming that at was the legacy of George W. Bush, who himself came into office criticizing Clinton for nation building, for soldiers in the Balkans holding the hands of children, walking them to school, things like that. So that debate is always going to be there. But I have been involved in U.S. foreign policy for almost 4 decades now. Show me the genocide that the United States president doesn't have to have values in. Bill Clinton thought he was a post-Cold War, post-conflict president. And what happened in Rwanda in his watch was a stain on his legacy and remains so to this day. I get it. It makes great, to write a speech like that can be very energizing. But when it meets the road test of reality in global affairs, where it's a lot messier than simply going into countries and holding the hands of school kids as they go to elementary school, it's about the hugely destabilizing influences that can come from within countries, not just from their external manifestations.
My next question will be about a kind of the policy mix that that creates and shapes the relationship with the allies. During the Cold War, there was a clear division of labor. The United States was providing critical capabilities and actually, needed to defend peace in Europe, peace in Pacific, while Europeans or Pacific allies were to focus on their economic development, well-being, prosperity, because there was also a crucial kind of the domestic dimension of a strategy of containment. Now we hear the critics of this kind of the division of labor, that actually the allies benefited too much from United States security umbrella, that they became a competitors for the United States. How you would see this division of labor in the future? Should allies do more for their own security? Should they go nuclear in some cases? How this balance should look like?
So I think I would dispute your unified theory of the division of labor, only in that the alliances that the United States has have been living institutions, and both the criteria and the expectations, the division of labor, have evolved and changed over time. Mm-hmm. So in 1949, when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded, while there was a appeal to democratic allies, it wasn't the central factor. When Greece and Turkey joined the alliance just a few years later, these weren't Jeffersonian democracies. One was a dictatorship and one was...
Nor Portugal.
Nor Portugal. Well, Portugal had a coup and a period of dictatorship during its tenure. But by 1996, when the Partnership for Peace program is launched, this becomes the gateway, the entry point. But it's a very different era.
Yep.
In 1949, it was a very simple proposition. Are you with us or against us? In 1996, it was, these are the things you have to do to join the club. In 1949, and through the next decade plus, the United States accumulated a network of alliances in both Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. But one of the central drivers of those were war-ravaged societies that were vulnerable. The United States was building a security superstructure around these societies that was genius because it allowed them over time to develop into mature democracies, with fits and starts. And fits and starts today in Central and Eastern Europe too. But if you have a longer view of the history, as long as you've got that security superstructure, it allows a society to make its own mistakes, to learn its own lessons, to mature as a democracy. And I think that's a huge thing. That's been the principal benefit to Central and Eastern Europe, even for Poland. And for Poland,
absolutely.
I was here in January of 2023, just a year after the war in Ukraine. You had 500,000 Russian soldiers just a few hundred miles to the east of the Polish border. And I was walking on the Nowy Świat, and children and snow and Christmas decorations and music, and the restaurants were full. You've got the Russian army a few hundred miles to the east marching in this direction, and Poland is secure, at peace, and confident. That confidence. Western investors weren't fleeing. Poles weren't looking for second homes to the west. Tourists weren't canceling their trips. Poland is secure. So it secured these societies from both external and internal duress as they grew and matured into strong democracies. That's the division of labor is a little bit different. But in the modern world, and in the modern political expectations that you hear in the United States, that's all fine. We want you to be happy. We want you to be confident. We want you to be secure. But you're also going to be expected to contribute, as Poland is.
Well, good time to talk more about Poland, because if you look at it, it was a pretty good description of a global situation, different theaters, China, Middle East, and Europe, Russia. Poland is in a slightly different position today. Of course, we are very much emotional, always talking about, Piłsudski, John Paul II, Lech Wałęsa.
And we are always complaining.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But today, the role of Poland is, because the war in Ukraine is completely different. And our dedication to improve and increase defense spendings, but also military capability, going out with contracts with the US. Is Poland visible in this big picture in the US, and what this picture is about today?
Poland is, but it was in a different way than it might have been even a generation ago. The enthusiasm to embrace new democracies like Poland after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact was it just, for those of us who worked in foreign policy during that time, it was the highlight of our careers. Poland has made enormous advances in the 30-plus years since it regained its 36 years since it regained its independence. But Poland is not at the center of American strategic thinking, in part because everything is going well. And the irony is that attention would be much more intense if things weren't going well in Poland. And to desire that combination of want that attention to be at the center and everything go right is something you have to reconcile yourselves. Mm-hmm. After the NATO enlargement debates, many Central and Eastern European countries would come to me and say, "What's the next big project?" It was so addictive to be at the center of the debate. And I just say, sometimes it's okay not to get all that attention. Mm-hmm. And Poland, I think Poland's in a great place. I would argue that you don't want more attention than you get right now. You just want to do your work, you want to grow your economy, you want to educate your children, you want to make your democracy secure, and do all the right things that are necessary to do that. You don't need to get attention for that.
Well, we will have soon a new president installed in office. We are doing this conversation before the elections, so we don't know the outcome yet. But do you have any recommendation for the new president how to deal with Trump's administration? What Poland should do? What priorities? Priorities it should have? Well, any new president, maybe not to the extent like United States, is a new chapter. He has both opportunities towards international partners, and there's also the possibility to avoid mistakes. So, what your recommendations would be?
Yeah. So, first of all, I wish you a successful election, and United States will be very much welcoming of whoever wins in whoever is the choice of the Polish people. I do think it's very important. Personal relationships matter, particularly with the Trump White House. So as soon as possible after the election, there has to be a priority of really in-person engagement. Phone calls. President Trump does a lot of phone calls with his international counterparts, but an in-person meeting as soon as possible. It's interesting because the transition will likely be fast enough that the next president will be at the NATO summit at The Hague, right? Yep. And that NATO summit is just 1 month from tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So you'll have a new president, and that person will be representing your nation at the NATO summit.
At the NATO summit, still President Duda will be representing
transition time.
So the transition won't be over yet. Okay, well, fair enough.
Anyway, he will be.
President Duda should bring the next president with him. There'd be a recommendation. Mm-hmm. And by the way, regardless of the political alignment, and one of the great things that happened early after your election was when President Duda and Prime Minister Tusk traveled together to Washington, D.C. I'm sure that was uncomfortable politically here in Poland because they come from different origins. But in the U.S., that was such a critical moment, because that was when we were really stuck in the debate about what to do with Ukraine. And it was in the lead up to our presidential election, so there were political currents in the United States too. But then President Duda went and met with President Trump as well, up in New York, I think, actually, not Mar-a-Lago. Hugely consequential, hugely helpful. This is a role that Poland can play, because Poland is a trusted source in the region, and you earned that trust. Poland has never been the country that Americans complain about for failing to meet its commitments to the transatlantic defense. And there's a certain credibility that was earned with that you bring to the debates of the United States. But also, Poland is seen as a robust democratic society with a full spectrum of views that contest for power in this country. And of course, there's the historic connections to Polonia, to the Polish-American community, which can be exaggerated because Poles like myself, 3-4 generations, I'm attuned to this part of the world because it's my area of expertise. Would I, if I were, at home doing some domestic job in my home state of Michigan, care so much about Poland's membership in NATO? I hope so, but probably not.
And about Europe, that's Europe, I would say, was designed under American leadership, both institutionally, but also, I would say, our political elite was shaped by this, kind of the notion that the United States is a leader of the free world. It's a defender, leader, and the country which actually shapes all the debate about state of democracy, international affairs. And now a lot of Europeans are puzzled. They don't know what to do with themselves, and there are thousands of ideas how to adapt to this, quite chaotic place we are living now. So what your recommendations for all Europeans would be, how they should think about themselves, their contribution to the transatlantic alliance, how they should deal with United States, which are reshaping itself, actually?
Well, I think it's, I'm always reluctant to reach contemporary judgments about the sweep of history. I think one tends to be too influenced by the moment, and I'm particularly uncomfortable when someone refers to something. This is a historic moment, or this is an inflection point in history. These are judgments best left to historians. But that said, something has definitely shifted, and it's not necessarily for the worse. But there is. Considering the fact that among the progression of reasons why we have such close partnerships and alliances, particularly in Europe, among those was the origin story of war-ruined countries emerging from World War II with vulnerable societies, and going up to 1989 and 91. Nations that had been repressed in imperial control for 70 years of their history, 75 years of their history, just now regaining independence and with vulnerable societies. And so those are unique moments. But we're a long way past both of those. We're 30 years past the first and 80 years past the second. And we're at a point where Europeans can do more in this alliance, and the expectation is they should do more. But some other things have changed too. So up until maybe say the early 2000s, I wouldn't pinpoint a specific date. There was a view that any efforts by the Europeans to do more potentially could come at the expense of the United States leadership in the transatlantic relationship. And there was an inverse too, which is any calls the United States for Europeans to do more was a weakening of U.S. commitment to Europe. I think that's changed, and it's changed in some ways slowly in some ways, in just under President Trump, abruptly, because he's brought a urgency and a intensity to this. But it has changed, regardless of whether one likes President Trump's way he enunciates his policies or executes them, should not mask the fact that there's been an underlying shift, and even underlying problem that's being addressed, which was Europe was too dependent upon the United States for its defense, pure and simple. Now, the question is how that evolves. I think there's a possibility here that it could evolve in a very durable way, and I'd even hazard to bet, because of my belief that this is in our interests as well as Europe's interests. I would be willing to bet that it will happen, that in January of 2029, the United States will swear in a new president of the United States against the backdrop of a very strong economic and security partnership between the United States and Europe.
Well, alliances matters. And since the Peloponnesian, lesson, we know it very well. And I see the U.S. Energy you're putting to build a strong alliances in the Pacific, relation with Japan, with South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, India, very much. And I see your efforts also in the Middle East to build, I would say, something like Abraham Accords 2.0. But Poland, if really not necessarily looking for additional attention, but Poland is not able to prevent or confront all of the challenges and threats we have alone. So if the Poland would take some initiative, like a 3 Cs, for example, to build a stronger platform, Baltic states, Nordic states, potentially maybe Denmark, Romania, whatever, would it be appreciated? Would it be welcome in the U.S., that kind of regional initiative to building stronger alliances project, not necessarily being counter NATO, but just to increase the ability states that we're sharing the same values and also understanding of threat.
Yeah. So just a first point on alliances, I tend to be very particular about how I use the word alliance. Mm-hmm. Alliances are treaty alliances. Those are alliances where each side has made formal commitments to the other side. But partnerships and friendships complement those. And many that you cited are very strong partnerships and friendships. I actually think we're in an era where, with the exception of possibly some slight additions to the NATO alliance, that we're going to add very few, if any, allies in the rest of the world. India is not interested in the kind of alliance, for example, that Japan or Australia or Korea have with the United States. And alliances offer something superior to friendships and partnerships. While you can have a big and capable partner like India, an ally is somebody with whom you've institutionalized your cooperation. And you know this, General, you've seen it, that you can't discount the degree to which we think as one, we act as one, we train as one, and that is largely unattainable outside the structure of an alliance. Inside the structure of an alliance, though, there is plenty of space for those kind of friendships and partnerships. We spoke at this conference this weekend, yesterday, about the E4, the 4 European countries that UK, France, Germany, and Poland, that are really energizing diplomacy and support for Ukraine right now. It's almost a second wave of energy catalyzing, I think, action in support of Ukraine just when we needed it. That's hugely important, and that can happen inside. But the UK is not an EU member. Some of this is in the EU context. All 4, of course, are NATO members, but even within NATO, these kind of initiatives, and even building a coalition of the willing that at some point might be in place to help secure Ukraine, that could involve even non-European countries, non-NATO countries. I think things like that, things like the 3 Cs initiative, things like the Visegrad group, I think those are actually very helpful. They're new ways to pulse energy into the system. And the other thing is, I think we have to avoid the temptation or risk to overload Brussels, overload NATO, with all the responsibilities of Europe. One of the big mistakes we made in the 1980s, and in my view, 1990s, excuse me, is of course not enlarging NATO. That was an incredibly, in hindsight, an incredibly fortuitous step to be able to enlarge the alliance at a permissive moment like we had in the 1990s. No regrets about that. But I think we, in that moment of hubris of the 1990s when democracy seemed like an inevitable course of history, we failed to likewise vitalize one institution in particular that I think was later we wished we had, which is the OSCE. That NATO was so intoxicated by its power that it also absorbed responsibility for all political and military dispute resolution in Europe in particular, but in the transatlantic space at large. And I think we overburdened the alliance. We brought Russia into the NATO-Russia Council, Permanent Joint Council initially. That was a mistake. It was a mistake in two respects. One is they had no business being there. And the other was that it's absolutely the worst thing we could have done for the Russian psyche, because we invited them to the table, but we put a children's table next to it. And I don't know how it is in Poland, but in American holidays, you invite all your family, and at a certain point, there's no more seats at the big table. And so then you sit at the kids' table. And it's particularly uncomfortable for the teenager who has to sit with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds while the adults are at the next table. You almost can't enjoy your dinner sitting at the kids' table. And we put Russia at the kids' table. If you were a friend of Russia, you wouldn't have brought them into this Permanent Joint Council. I think it was a foolish, but what we could have done is we could have re-energized the OSCE as a place to resolve human rights issues, ethnic issues, sectarian issues. We could have taken a lot off. So I'd be careful. I like the idea of setting up these subunits because they don't require everything to come out of NATO, because NATO, overburdened, it loses sense of its one singular purpose, which is to protect the transatlantic space.
We start from the notion of this place, genius loci, to some extent. Do you think that President Trump would be interested to speak from the same place John Paul II to deliver his famous speech?
And telling us, don't be afraid.
I sure hope so. And I will say that probably one of the best and most inspirational speeches President Trump gave in his first term was here in Warsaw.
Indeed.
Was that a different administration? Was that a different Trump? Would that speech have been given? Would that speech be given in the first year of his second term? What a great opportunity! And even better, he should bring the new Pope with him to do it. The new Pope, Leo XIV, has shown an interest in Ukraine that is refreshing, recognizing who the victim is and who the aggressor is. The Vatican has been the location for a recovery of the relationship between President Trump and President Zelensky a few weeks ago, and then just a week ago at the inaugural mass of the new Pope, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, and President Zelensky. There's got to be something special about that. History has shown that once before with a Polish primate in Rome, and boy, what a great opportunity that would be. It almost gives me a chill down my spine to think about what a communications opportunity, much less a policy opportunity, would be to stand in that square and reassure people that we all have the ability.
So, Steve, I got a dream. The next conference we will have a chance to compare, because Edward Gierek and Jaruzelski, the Poles are very much proud about the John Paul II, but I'm not sure that the strategic leadership in Poland was happy. So it would be interesting to see whether the Trump will be happy having an American, Pope.
The strategic leadership in the Vatican wasn't happy either.
Steve, thank you very much.
Amazing, thank you
for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our audience. I hope you enjoy our conversation, the same we did. Again, great to have you.
Big pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
Szanowni Państwo, bardzo dziękujemy za uwagę. Naszym i Państwa gościem był Stephen Biegun. Dziękujemy bardzo.
Fit King gofry. Przepyszne, gotowe do zjedzenia gofry bez dodatku cukru. W wersji klasycznej lub oblanej czekoladą. Dostępne tylko w sklepie SFD.
Partnerem kanału jest XTB, aplikacja inwestycyjna, z którą zaangażujesz do pracy Twoje pieniądze.
Z kartą Zen. Zapomnij o elektronice, która psuje się zaraz po zakończeniu gwarancji.
Partnerem Kanału Zero jest producent boskich kiełbas bez osłonki JBB Baudyga. Jedz bardziej bosko.
Najnowszy magazyn Zero już dostępny. 400 stron najlepszych autorów. Zamów na magazyn.zero.pl. Włącz powiadomienia i nie przegap żadnej nowości. Pobierz już teraz. Zeskanuj kod QR lub znajdź nas w swoim sklepie z aplikacjami. Kliknij w jeden z polecanych filmów, aby obejrzeć najlepsze produkcje kanału Zero.